Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Du Fu, whom I'm reading in the Norton Anthology of World Literature. Now, Du Fu, along with Li Bai, was one of the most important poets of the Tang Dynasty in China. Apparently, he wasn't particularly recognized as a great poet during the Tang Dynasty, but according to the introduction here, during the Song Dynasty, which succeeded the Tang in 960 and ruled through 1279, Du Fu became one of the most important poets. So, Du Fu is kind of an interesting contrast to Li Bai, because whereas Li Bai has this sort of romantic sort of wildness, this sort of freedom, and this sort of ability to I'd almost describe him as a poet who flows. Again, in the way that like Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley and people like this have this sort of open freedom. Du Fu, in a way, he's more regulated. He's more almost Victorian in his approach. And this is both in terms of his poetic form. He writes a lot of very sort of highly regulated, highly formal poetry, typically in these four stanza poems, with each stanza being two lines. So four couplets, basically. And you can see this visually in poems like Painted Hawk. We've got four couplets here. The same thing with Moonlight Night. Four couplets. This is a very common style for Du Fu. His subject matter is also a bit more restrained, whereas Li Bai has this sort of extravagant, I'm gonna get drunk with the moon and live out in nature and be free and things like this kind of ethos. Du Fu is much more concerned with current events, with politics, with family life, but also with chronicling everyday people's experience of these big historical events, particularly the Anlushan Rebellion, which takes place in 755. So that was a rebellion where the capital of the Tang Dynasty was actually captured by the rebels, and Du Fu was sort of not taken along when the court fled. So he ended up trapped in this occupied capital for a while until he was able to escape and rejoin his family. So a lot of his poems deal with the experience of this rebellion and how it sort of undermined society, how it compromised important social values and things like this. So in the poem Moonlight Night, for instance, Du Fu imagines his wife, who did escape the capital. Chang'an was the Tang capital. When Chang'an fell, his wife escaped, but he did not. And so this poem imagines her imagining him or missing him. From her room in Fuzhou tonight, all alone she watches the moon. Far away, I grieve that her children can't understand why she thinks of Chang'an. Fragrant mist in her cloud hair damp, clear lucence on her jade arms cold. When will we lean by chamber curtains and let it light the two of us, our tear stains dry? So again, there's that sort of imagining of his wife, this idea that she's grieving for him, she's looking up at the moon, she's by the window, she's sad, etc., etc. But then we've got that thing that we get so often in Chinese poetry, Japanese poetry. We've got a turn at the end. So the last couplet here is, when will we lean by chamber curtains and let it light the two of us, our tear stains dried? So again, we've got that movement from here's my wife, she's sad, she misses me, to sometime in the future, this will be resolved. We will be together again and we'll be happy again. And again, the poem is written in that very regular structure of 4 couplets, which Du Fu really likes. In Chang Village 1, we actually get kind of a not necessarily a follow-up directly, but we get the resolution of this, which is that he has escaped now from Chang'an, and he's reunited with his wife. So in Chang Village 1, this is the poem. Lofted and lifted west of the clouds of red, the track of the sun descends to the level earth. By the brushwood gate songbirds and sparrows chaffer, and the homebound stranger from 1,000 li arrives. 1,000 li is about 250 miles, by the way. Wife and children marvel that I'm here. When the shock wears off, still they wipe away tears. In the disorders of the age was I lost and flung, that I return alive as a happening of chance. Neighbors swarm up to the tops of the walls, touching and sighing, even they sob and weep. The night wastes on, and still we hold the candle across from one another as if asleep and in a dream. So again, we've got that chronicling of contemporary experience with the Anlushan rebellion and the difficulties that Du Fu experiences with escaping, and again, the reaction not only of his family but of the neighbors as well, with this this sort of amazement and shock that he's been able to escape the occupied capital and return home alive. It was really really significant in terms of giving us a sense of how people experience this turbulent revolt. But it's also a long-term thing, and his poem Ballad of the Firewood Vendors gives us a sense of just how long the impact of this rebellion was. Because it chronicles the experiences years later of women who have not been able to find husbands because of the number of men who died in this rebellion. But the thing that I find really striking about Ballad of the Firewood Vendors is it's almost like the Dutch masters, the painters who began painting scenes of peasant life or of everyday people almost for the first time in history, or in the history of European art at least. They began chronicling visually the lives of ordinary people. Ballad of the Firewood Vendors kind of does the same thing. Like it takes us to these ordinary women and talks about how their lives have been profoundly shaped by these big historical events that they didn't have any real control over or anything. So this is Ballad of the Firewood Vendors. Guizhou women, hair half gray, 40, 50, and still no husbands. Since the ravages of rebellion, harder than ever to marry. A whole life steeped in bitterness and long sighs. Local custom decrees that men sit, women stand. Men mind the house door, women go out and work. At 18, 19, off peddling firewood, with money they get from firewood making ends meet. Till they're old, hair in 2 buns dangling to the neck, stuck with wildflowers, a mountain leaf, a silver pin. They struggle up the steep paths, flock to the market gate, risk their lives for extra gain by dipping from salt wells. Faces powdered, heads adorned, sometimes a trace of tears. Cramped fields, thin clothing, the weariness of stony slopes. But if you say all are ugly as the women of Witch's Mountain, how to account for Jean Jun, born in a village to the north? And according to the footnote here, Wang Zhangzhu was a stunningly beautiful court lady of the Han Dynasty who embodied the suffering of exile because she was married off to a tribal chief of the fierce Xiongnu tribes as part of Han diplomacy on the unruly frontier. So, I mean, this is again a poem about just ordinary people, ordinary women who have experienced the these hardships in life, particularly not being able to find husbands, and for that reason not being able to be financially comfortable. Like, they've made the best living they could from the limited options available to them, but because those options are so limited, um, they haven't had as much financial comfort, financial stability as the women who are able to find husbands. And we get these great descriptions of them. I mean, they're subtle, but there are these great descriptions of them with their faces powdered, where how they wear their hair, what what sort of jewelry, but what sort of adornment they put in their hair, whether it's um, oh, sorry, wild flowers, a mountain leaf, a silver pin. So again, you can picture these women, um, now elderly, well, elderly by the standards of this was written in 766. I mean, elderly definitely by the standards of the 8th century, 40, 50, um, definitely like worn down by decades of toil, worn down by decades of not having enough food, not having enough warm clothing, shelter, etc., etc. You can really like picture these women from the poem, and it's, I mean, it's a heart-wrenching scene. Again, you think, I think at least of like the Dutch masters, and like uh, these paintings of peasants in the fields and things like this doing their labor. I think we get the same kind of thing here with Doofy.